Thanks everyone for being here tonight. It's really encouraging to see the amount of people and interest in this particular issue. As someone living with HIV for nearly 30 years of my life now, of course this is an issue that is very close and dear to my heart. I think just some of the inequity of information between the different parties that have shown up so far tonight can tell you how difficult it can be to navigate living in the real world with this disease. Part of the issues that we have here is what is significant risk. We have a doctor's view and then we have a legal view. And trying to unpack all of those things and make sense of it becomes very difficult for people, especially when they're newly diagnosed. I'd just like to point out again, and this is more from a public health perspective and not as a court perspective, but the bottom line here is if you get tested and you find out you're HIV, you're in big trouble, or could be, because there's not really any time limits on any of this stuff. So part of the problem for us is when these cases started to come up, and we've been following these since Courier. In fact, BCPWA was involved in that particular case. There's a lot of things that we've found out over the years that become very problematic. We've seen an inconsistency between provinces. So if I was in Manitoba right now, I'd be a little frightened. The other part is, and one thing that was a little bit discussed was around the media part. And with the one case that we talked about, JAT, who will remain nameless, certainly wasn't at the time the case was brought forth, and the police went on a fishing expedition. That's all I can say about that, because they were really looking to see if they could stir more stuff up. And that put shivers through the community. How do we do our work? How do we reach out to people and make sure that they're getting the care and the supports that they need when we have a media basically saying, well, if you've ever had sex with this person, you need to call the police department right now. The problem is they don't frame that. They don't frame on what kind of sex you can get HIV from. It's anything. So, with these cases coming out, we have a 1-800 number, and we were getting people calling us saying, well, I French kissed someone, and it's kind of like, that takes up a lot of time where we can be providing services directly to our membership. I'll just explain what Positive Living Society of BC is, and it is pretty much Canada's largest organization run by and for people living with HIV. So we have a real interest in the criminalization of HIV. We've seen cases throughout the country where, the decisions have been a little bit mind-boggling, and we're glad that they're going to appeal, but that doesn't answer the questions of the actual lived experience on the ground. How do we act? What do we do? When do we have to disclose? How much do we have to disclose? And those are things that, quite frankly, if I hadn't been tested for HIV and I didn't show any symptoms, I don't know if I'd want to. Sorry, but that's the reality. Because there's a lot of burden put on people living with HIV to do these things. And I think the JAT case really put into perspective. Until then, most of the cases were centered around heterosexuals, and we thought maybe in the gay community a little bit smug, that maybe that would stay over there. But when we had some of these other cases come by, all of a sudden the whole ground changed. Everyone started looking back. It's like, did I really make sure that everyone knew, blah, blah, blah? And, there's certain things that happen in the gay culture that are a little bit different, perhaps, than in the mainstream. How is that going to play out? The courts see things from a blind perspective, so, they're not going to see some of these differences. And so it put, again, just a cold shiver into our community. And then other part of it is the stigma around HIV. We're still not talking about sex in general in our society in a way that actually we can have a dialogue that makes sense around this. This is such a charged issue. I've had people throw garbage at me, for being HIV positive. I haven't done anything to them. It's like, what is that about? So until we can have some common sense discussions around the whole criminalization issue, and some of the decisions that have come up have seemed pretty counterproductive from our point of view. And it's not necessarily the court's faults. I mean, we certainly, as an organization, struggle with some of those horrible cases where people have gone out and infected people on purpose. I think that the majority of people living with HIV, I'd say almost all of us cringe at that idea, but those are the things that the media picks up, and that's what the public gets in the back of their head. And it was like 30 years ago when you came out as being gay, you were child molester, all these other things, and none of those things are really true. But there's these things that are planted from the media, from the different sensationalized court cases, where we have to live with that. So, in just kind of wrapping this up, it's a very slippery slope for us to even know how to deal with these things. Because in sex acts, again, we have a continuum of risk factors. And, we have the medical side telling us, well, these things you don't want to be doing. This is dangerous. These other things, not so much. We think there's actually pretty little risk on that. And then what is significant risk? We've had two opinions on the front table tonight that are this far apart. So how does the average person living with HIV make those decisions? Right? Do we live in a bubble? Do we not have sex? And I'll tell you, that's not going to happen. But the problem here again is we have sex and all of these charged issues, and no one really wants to have those discussions. So until we start doing that, we're not really going to get forward on this, and the court cases just seem to really aggravate this and make it worse. I wish I had a nice answer to say how we can do that, but I look back at some of the situations like with when Ontario wanted to do their enhanced sex education. That got squashed. And I was actually asked to comment about that at one point, and I said, well, do you want to put a gun to your kids' heads? Because if you're not giving them the right information, how are they going to make right decisions? And quite frankly, most of the young people I've run into make pretty good decisions when they have the right information, as most of us do. So I think part of it, again, is just to pull this back in, is for those, as a service provider, trying to actually, work with people living with HIV. I mean, especially around newly diagnosed, and the technology getting far and far better on, when that infection took place. We have to be really careful. We don't want to get embroiled in a bunch of legal battles trying to provide services and information to people living with a disease. And, the evidence out there is like, I had an AIDS diagnosis in 1995. Obviously, people around the room here, if you look at me right now, do I look like I have AIDS? You can't take the diagnosis away, but the reality is our lives are much different than they were. And when the Courier case was being charged, I was very ill, and I had a very high viral load. And I could have been very infectious, and I also had a negative partner. I will happily say that he is still negative. But the whole point of the matter is unless we have rational discussions about this and actually talk about these issues without all of the sensationalism that the media puts on it, and quite frankly, the newspapers, I still have those clippings because they're part of our records. They're going to be part of our history of how we dealt with this. And I hope that for people that are within the court systems and are looking at these cases, as individuals living with this disease, we don't really even know what to do. One last thing is every year, over the last few years, we've had something called the Positive Gathering, which gathers HIV positive people from all over the province, and we do workshops and those kinds of things to help make our lives better and educate ourselves. And every time we have a HIV and criminalization workshop, the place is packed, just like it is tonight, because we want to know just as much as you. And the last part of it, the last thing I'm going to say is, generally people, when they find out that they're HIV positive, change their behaviors with the right tools and education. We can't reach them if they're not getting tested. We have a huge project happening in this province, and believe me, it's pretty amazing what's going on in the backgrounds here with our public health system. We really do have one of the best in the world. Let's not screw this project up, because it is really important, and we can finally get some closure on this disease. And believe me, after living with this thing for 30 years, any good news is good news. Thank you.